Member for Higgins, I think.
Yes, that would be me.
She'd like to jump.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise today to speak on the Territory Stolen Generations Redress Schemes Bill 2021 Facilitation Bill and consequential amendments. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to note the moving comments made by the previous speaker, the member for Barton, and acknowledge the work that she has done in supporting Indigenous Australians. Mr Deputy Speaker, the bills before us today are actually incredibly significant. They address the topic that so long was ignored many years ago and then for so long not acted upon genuinely, but which this government seeks to redress, with a commitment that is practical and works to address measures in this issue. That topic is reconciliation, one of the darkest chapters of our country's history, and we cannot turn a blind eye out of shame. We must face this issue and work towards a future that addresses and assists with the healing of the trauma caused. The redress scheme is just one step in healing, an acknowledgement of the harm caused by forced removal from family that was experienced by victims of the stolen generation, and a financial and wellbeing focused reimbursement that addresses this. This bill will support intergenerational healing and hopes to positively impact the lives of survivors. Mr Deputy Speaker, the bills before us today allow for the facilitation of the redress scheme for stolen generation survivors. It will ensure that participants of the redress scheme will not be adversely affected by decreased access to other Commonwealth funds. This is only logical, as we cannot punish those who our country has already caused so much pain to in the past. Moreover, the bills will ensure that there is cross-checking of identity information so that these reconciliation efforts are directed towards those who truly deserve it and cannot be exploited in any way by others. These bills stand as an important step in the Morrison government's commitment to reconciliation. The gravity of the bills before us cannot be understated, for they stand to solidify the redress scheme to protect Indigenous Australians as we, as a nation, pursue reconciliation. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Morrison government will be investing nearly $400 million over the next 5 years in the redress effort. It will encompass a focus on both financial security and wellbeing for affected individuals, as I'm sure all of this in this place are keen on. These bills affect those who are forcibly taken from their homes in the Northern Territory, Australian Capital Territory or the Jervis Bay Territory. I'm proud to be a member of the National Redress Committee. The redress scheme itself encompasses a one-off payment of $75,000 in recognition of the harm caused by the forced removal, combined with a $7,000 healing assistance payment in recognition of the variety of manners in which an individual undergoes their own healing journey. But on top of these financial reimbursements, survivors will be given the opportunity to confidentially tell their story and to receive face-to-face or written personal response. Now, as a paediatrician, I know how important it is for people to be able to share their story. In fact, as a doctor, there is much to be said about the healing of telling a story. Bedside manner is incredibly important, but the narrative of a shared story has an important therapeutic component. In circumstances where the stolen generation survivor has recently passed, an application on behalf of their family or estate can be submitted. An acknowledgement that the trauma experienced by survivors transcends the generations. Of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, not all problems can be solved with this government effort, but it does stand as one small crucial step in acknowledging the economic imbalance Indigenous Australians do face. Mr Deputy Speaker, the redress scheme is by no means the only action the Morrison government is taking to address the conversation of reconciliation. Indeed, in the 2021-2022 budget, the government committed over $50 million to fund over 100 organisations supporting members of the stolen generation and their families. This support includes important activities such as family tracing, so that stolen generation survivors can understand their ancestry and learn of their families. It is harrowing to think that they have been disconnected, discombobulated from their inheritance, and the ability to be able to find and trace that lineage and pattern is incredibly important for people who are seeking to understand where they've come from. Reunion services are also being funded so that these Australians can again meet their families and share a crucial connection that no redress payment itself can offer. Not only this, but various counselling and healing support services will be made available to provide emotional support to help mend the lasting pains caused by family separation. And Mr Deputy Speaker, the Morrison government is not limiting government support to stolen generation survivors. Instead, all Indigenous Australians are privy to support. This builds on the work this government is doing to close the gap. That is why the last year's budget commitment to deliver support to Indigenous Australians to build skills and find employment is so important. This comes along efforts towards education with a focus particularly on the young. On top of this, the Morrison government has committed hundreds of millions of dollars towards women's safety and economic security, mental health, aged care, as well as the environment and land management. As we all know, the gap between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians has been broad, wide, and is not closed at the speed we would all like. The gap is in education, health, life expectancy, employment, housing, and youth in detention. In fact, the rates of incarceration of Indigenous Australians in this country remains a national disgrace. Mr Deputy Speaker, the redress scheme will be survivor-focused and trauma-informed to ensure that there is no further harm done to survivors. Stolen generation organisations will be consulted as the scheme is refined to ensure that it is culturally appropriate and gives Indigenous Australians the best opportunity to reconcile with the past and enter the future with stronger financial and wellbeing foundations. Not only this, but the National Indigenous Australians Agency has consulted broadly across the various departments of the Commonwealth Government to ensure that the bills will have their intended effect. The Morrison government has sought and will continue to seek the very best advice on how to implement reconciliation efforts in this country. It cannot be a matter of government to decide all policy regarding issues of this nature. We must consult with Indigenous Australian agencies and groups to understand the suffering of these Australians. That is why the government has done so much preparation for this scheme and the bills that are presented to us today. And at this point I'd like to note, as the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Minister Ken White, himself an Indigenous Australian, has said, we need to co-design all that we do. Indigenous Australians have had enough things done to them. We now need to work to make sure that we do things with them. Like the Indigenous concept of yarning. That is why I support the voice and am very proud to be on the working group of Indigenous recognition in this parliament. Mr Deputy Speaker, these bills and the redress scheme they represent are never going to be enough to truly say sorry to the Indigenous Australians affected in the stolen generation and their families, but is certainly a step in the right direction. As Australians, we cannot forget our past. The way forward is not to feel shame, but optimism and hope in the future of our country. Optimism that we can someday reach a point where Indigenous Australians are on a level playing field and are not brought down by the continuing effects of past policy. As I said in my first speech, a strong country is a country at peace with its past. This bill is one more step on the path to atonement and reconciliation. And for this reason, I commend these bills to the House. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Order. The question is that this bill be now read as second.